The dirt hit his face before the sound of the shovel ever reached his ears. Daniel Cole did not fight the rope around his wrists. He had stopped fighting 3 days ago, back when the tribunal read out charges that were never his. Treason, desertion, the murder of men he had bled beside. He knew every word was false, and he knew no one in that courtroom cared. Commander Aldrich Voss had made sure of that. Voss stood at the edge of the pit now, arms folded, watching with the calm of a man closing a book he had already finished reading. The soldiers did not march Daniel to the usual execution ground outside the fort. They marched him north, past the tree line, past the old warning markers that no one in the company had ever explained. The ground there was different, cracked in strange circular patterns, scorched black in places where nothing should have burned. The men whispered about it, but never asked questions out loud. Everyone knew this land belonged to something older than the kingdom. Daniel had heard the stories as a boy. Dragon Country, the old-timers called it, a graveyard no living soul was foolish enough to walk into. He was foolish enough now. Or rather, he had no choice. They forced him to his knees at the edge of a hole already dug, too deep and too wide for an ordinary grave. Daniel looked at Voss one last time, searching his commander's face for some trace of guilt, some flicker of the man who had once shared rations with him during the siege of Ashford Ridge. He found nothing, only the tight, controlled satisfaction of a man erasing a problem. "Any last words, soldier?" Voss asked, and his voice did not shake at all. Daniel had many. He said none of them. Some men did not deserve the dignity of a response. The first shovel of dirt landed on his shoulder, cold and heavy, and Daniel understood in that moment that this was not an execution meant to be witnessed. This was meant to be forgotten, buried in a place no patrol would ever search, no priest would ever bless, no family would ever visit. Voss was not just killing him. He was making sure Daniel Cole never existed at all. The soldiers worked quickly, refusing to meet his eyes, and Daniel felt the weight build across his chest, his legs, his throat. He forced his breathing to slow, the way his old sergeant had taught him years ago in a different kind of darkness. Panic kills faster than the wound does, the man used to say. Daniel held on to that thought as the light above him narrowed to a thin gray line, then to nothing at all. The world went silent and heavy and still. He did not know how long he lay there in that crushing dark, only that somewhere beneath the pain, beneath the growing numbness of his fingers, he became aware of something impossible. The ground beneath his back was warm, not the fading warmth of sun-baked earth. A deep, steady warmth, like something alive was breathing just beneath him, patient and slow. Then the earth around him trembled. At first Daniel thought it was his own body failing, some final betrayal of a heart giving out. But the tremor came again, stronger, accompanied by a sound he felt more than heard, a low rumble that rolled through the soil like distant thunder trapped underground. Dirt shifted against his face. Something was moving beneath him, something enormous. The last clear thought Daniel Cole had before the darkness swallowed him completely was not fear. It was a strange, aching curiosity, because for one impossible heartbeat, he could have sworn the ground beneath him had a heartbeat of its own. Daniel woke to open sky. That was the first wrong thing. He had been buried. He remembered the weight, the cold press of earth against his eyes, the slow fading of his own breath. Now he lay on his back staring up at gray morning clouds, air moving freely across his face, and the only sound around him was a low, rhythmic breathing that was not his own. He turned his head, every muscle screaming in protest, and saw the source of the warmth that had saved his life. A dragon lay curled around the pit, like a wall of scale and bone, easily 3 times the length of the longhouse back at the fort. Her hide was a deep gray of storm clouds, threaded through with faint silver lines that pulsed faintly, like veins carrying starlight instead of blood. One wing was tore along the edge, old wounds that had never healed clean. Her eyes, when they opened and found him, were the color of amber left too long in firelight. Dimmed but not dead, Daniel should have run. Every instinct screamed at him to run. Instead, he found himself frozen, not from fear alone, but from something closer to recognition, as if some old part of him already understood what he was looking at. "You are slower to wake than your grandfather," the dragon said. Her voice was not a roar, nor was a growl shaped into words. It moved through the air like something felt as much as heard, deep and unhurried, carrying an accent that belonged to no human kingdom. Daniel's mind stumbled over the sentence twice before the meaning settled into him. My grandfather, he repeated, his throat raw from dirt and disuse. You don't know my grandfather. I did not say I know him, the dragon answered. I said you woke slower than he did, the last time the earth tried to keep him. Daniel pushed himself upright, wincing at the ache in his ribs, and studied her more carefully. She did not lunge. She did not posture the way the old war stories always describe dragons behaving toward men, teeth bared and fire building in the throat. She simply watched him, patient in a way only something very old and very tired could be patient. Who are you? Daniel asked. Verith, she said. Once, I was called Queen of the Southern Reaches. Now I am mostly called nothing by no one because there is almost no one left to speak my name. The words landed heavier than Daniel expected. He looked past her, out across the cracked, blackened ground that stretched toward the tree line, the same land the soldiers had whispered about for years without ever explaining why. This is a graveyard, Daniel said slowly. This whole place. Yes, Vera said. My kind buried their dead here for longer than your kingdom has had a name, and it seems your commander Voss knew that, though I doubt he understood why it mattered. Daniel's chest tightened at the mention of Voss. You know him? I know what runs in his blood, Vera said, and something shifted behind her amber eyes, something that looked almost like old grief, the same thing that runs in yours, though it has been diluted by cowardice, and yours has not yet been tested at all. Daniel opened his mouth to demand an explanation, but Vera shifted, and pain visibly rippled through her enormous frame. The silver lines along her hide dimmed further, flickering like a lantern low on oil. Daniel realized in what he had missed in his shock, that she was not simply resting beside the pit. She was dying, slowly, and had been for some time. You're hurt, he said. I have been hurt for a very long time, Verith answered. Longer than your entire kingdom has stood. I came to this place to die where my ancestors died, and instead I felt something stir beneath the earth that I have not felt in 300 years. What did you feel? Verith's gaze fixed on him, steady despite her weakening breath. You, Daniel Cole. I felt you before I ever smelled the fresh dirt above your grave. Your blood called to this ground the way a bell calls to an empty room. It was answered before it ever knew it was ringing. Daniel felt the ground tilt slightly beneath him, though nothing physical had moved. I don't understand any of this. No, Verith agreed, her voice softening in a way that felt almost gentle. But you will. There's a truth in your family's blood older than the kingdom that tried to bury you. And if I do not tell you before the sun sets twice more, I fear no one else alive still can. She drew a slow, uneven breath, and for a moment Daniel thought she might simply stop there mid-sentence, her strength finally spent. Instead, she lowered her head until her enormous eye was level with his, close enough that he could see his own reflection in the amber surface, small and dirt-streaked and very much alive. There were once warriors bonded to my kind, she said. Humans who stood beside dragons as equals, who fought a war neither of us could win alone. Your family carries their blood, Daniel Cole. And unless I am gravely mistaken, that blood is the only reason the earth chose to wake me instead of simply letting me die in peace. Daniel sat in silence for a long moment, letting the words settle over him the way dust settles after a collapse. Bonded warriors. A blood tied to something ancient enough to predate the kingdom itself. It should have sounded like the ramblings of a dying creature, and yet some quiet part of him recognized the shape of the truth even before his mind could accept it. That's not possible, he said, though the words carried less certainty than he intended. My family were farmers, then soldiers. There's no history of anything like what you're describing. History is written by those who survived to write it, Vera said, and the ones who destroyed the Dragonbond warriors made certain that very few survived. Dragonbond warriors. Daniel turned the words over, feeling their strange weight. Why haven't I ever heard that name before? Because it was meant to be forgotten, Verith answered. Not lost by accident, Daniel. Erased on purpose. She shifted again, drawing in a slow breath before continuing, and Daniel noticed how carefully she paced herself now, as though each word cost her something she could not easily spare. Long before your kingdom drew its first border, humans and dragons stood together against an enemy that came from beyond the sky. Not myth, not legend, an enemy with ships of black metal and no mercy in their hearts. The war lasted generations. It was won, in the end, but at a terrible cost. Most of my kind died defending your ancestors. Most of the bonded warriors died defending mine. Daniel's mind went unbidden to the strange burned scars across the northern ridges, the ones no one had ever properly explained. He had always assumed old wildfires. He was no longer certain. Those who remained made a choice, Verith continued, to bury the truth alongside the dead. They feared that if word spread of what had been unleashed once, it might be provoked to return. So the bond was hidden. The warriors' bloodline scattered and renamed. Dragons withdrew to places men would not think to search. It worked for a long while, perhaps too well. If it was hidden that carefully, Daniel said slowly, how did Voss find out? Something in Verith's expression tightened. And for the first time since he had woken beside her, Daniel saw something that looked almost like anger cross the ancient creature's face. That is the part of this story that troubles me most, she said, because Aldred Voss did not stumble upon this knowledge by chance. His family carried a thinner strand of the same blood as yours, Daniel, weaker but present. Somewhere in his family's past, someone chose to hide that truth as fiercely as your own ancestors did, though for very different reasons. Daniel felt something cold settle low in his stomach. What reasons? Shame, Vera said simply, or perhaps fear. I do not know the full account, only fragments carried by dragons who once watched from a distance. But I know this. When old bloodlines resurface, the earth itself responds. You felt nothing when you were marched to this grave. But somewhere inside him, some part of Voss may have felt exactly what was buried beneath this ground, and exactly what would happen if it woke. The pieces began arranging themselves in Daniel's mind, slow and unwelcome. Voss had not simply wanted him dead. Voss had wanted him buried here specifically, in ground that history had marked for exactly this kind of blood, and Daniel doubted now that this was coincidence at all. He didn't do this because he thought I was a traitor, Daniel said quietly. He did this because he was afraid of what I might become. Afraid, Verith agreed, or perhaps envious. A weaker bloodline standing in the shadow of a stronger one has driven men to far worse than false charges. Daniel Cole. I have watched it happen among your kind more than once across the centuries. Daniel pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to steady the storm of thoughts moving through him. 3 days ago, his life had been simple in its cruelty. Frame condemned, buried. Now the ground beneath that condemnation had shifted into something vast and old and far more dangerous than a single corrupt commander. Why now, he finally asked. If this blood has been quiet for generations, why did it wake now? Why did the earth respond to me and not to anyone else who came before me? Verith's amber eyes dimmed further, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something Daniel had not yet heard from her. Not simply grief, but urgency. Because I am the last, she said. The last dragon of the Dragonbond line still living, and I have felt something stirring in the northern sky. For 3 nights now. Ships, Daniel, black and silent, moving the way they moved 300 years ago, before the First War began. I came to this graveyard to die in peace, believing there was no one left who could carry what I know forward. She lowered her head until her breast stirred the dirt, still clinging to his sleeves. Instead, the earth gave me you. Daniel did not sleep that night, though Verith insisted his body needed rest more than his mind needed answers. He sat instead at the mouth of the shallow cave where she had dragged herself for shelter, staring north toward the dark ridge line, waiting for some sign of the ships she had described. Waiting and dreading in equal measure. He did not have to wait long. Just before dawn, 3 streaks of pale light cut across the sky, moving with a smoothness no falling star ever possessed. They did not burn out. They did not arc downward and vanish behind the horizon like meteors. They slowed, hovered for the span of several heartbeats, and then descended in careful, deliberate formations somewhere beyond the northern hills. Verith's breathing changed the moment she saw them, a low sound rising in her throat that was not quite a growl and not quite a moan of pain. Scoreth, she said, and the word carried a weight Daniel had never heard in any human language. They have returned sooner than I feared. You said this happened before, Daniel said, watching the last traces of light fade from the sky. 300 years ago. Longer than that, in truth, Vareth answered. The war I told you was not the first time they came. It was simply the last time anyone alive remembers clearly. They harvest, Daniel. Not conquer, not settle. They strip a world of what they need and leave when there is nothing left worth taking. My kind fought them once before your people ever stood beside us, and we lost so badly that only a handful of my ancestors survived to teach the next generation what little we knew. What do they want here? What are they harvesting? I do not know entirely, Vareth admitted, and the honesty in her voice was somehow more unsettling than a confident answer would have been. Something beneath the mountains, I believe, something old and powerful that this world holds, buried as deep as the truth we've just been discussing. I only know that when they came before, they did not stop until every Dragonbond warrior and every dragon who stood beside them was dead or scattered beyond finding. Daniel felt the full shape of the danger settle over him, heavier than the dirt that had once buried him. This was no longer simply about clearing his name or understanding a bloodline he had never asked for. Somewhere beyond those hills, an enemy that had once nearly erased 2 species from the world was beginning to move again. How do we stop them? He asked. Vareth was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Daniel began to fear she had no answer at all. We do not, she finally said. Not you and I alone. I am the last of my line, Daniel, but I am not the last dragon living in this world. There are others scattered across the old territories, hidden the same way your bloodline was hidden. Some do not know what they came from. Some have chosen to forget on purpose. All of them believe, as I once did, that they are entirely alone. Then we find them. It will not be simple. Many will not trust a human, no matter what blood runs in his veins. Fewer still will trust one accused of treason, hunted by his own kingdom. Vareth studied him with something that looked, for the first time, close to sympathy. And I am no longer strong enough to fly beside you and prove your claim myself. Daniel looked at her wing, torn and healing wrong, and understood the weight of what she was telling him. Whatever help she could offer, it would not come in the form of strength at her side in battle. It would come in knowledge, in guidance, in the strange authority of her name and bloodline vouching for his. Then tell me where to start, he said. Something shifted in Vareth's expression. Not quite a smile, since dragons were not built for such things, but something close enough that Daniel recognized it anyway. There's a bonding call, she said. Passed through blood, older than any spoken language your kingdom uses now. Your ancestors used it to call dragons to their side in the First War. I do not know if it still lives in you, Daniel Cole, weakened as your line has become through generations of forgetting. But if it does, and if you are willing to try, it may be the only thing standing between this world and what came before. Daniel thought of Voss, standing calm and satisfied at the edge of his grave. He thought of the soldiers who had followed orders without question, of the false charges that had nearly buried the truth along with him. And he thought, finally, of the black ships descending silently over the northern ridge, patient and certain, the way predators are patient when they already believe the hunt is over. Then I'm willing, he said, whatever it takes. Vareth lowered her head one final time before the coming dawn fully broke across the ruined ground between them. Then rest what little you can, she said. Tomorrow, Daniel Cole, we begin waking the dead. The bonding call, as Vareth explained it, was not a spoken thing. It lived somewhere beneath language, in blood and breath, and the old rhythms of heart that remembered what its owner had never been taught. She could not teach Daniel the words, because there were none. She could only guide him toward the place inside himself where his ancestors had once carried it, and hope that 300 years of silence had not worn the path away entirely. They traveled north the following 2 days, Vareth moving slowly along hidden game trails that kept them clear of any patrol Voss might send searching for a corpse that refused to remain buried. Daniel's strength returned gradually. Fueled by root vegetables Vareth showed him how to find, and by a grim determination that had nowhere else to go. Each night, she taught him what she could, how to sit still enough that his own pulse became audible to him, how to listen for something beneath that pulse, older and slower, waiting. On the third night, at the base of a mountain range Vareth called the Old Wardens, she told him it was time to try. Daniel sat cross-legged on a flat stone, the cold air sharp as lungs, and closed his eyes the way she had shown him. He expected to feel foolish. Instead, as his breathing slowed, he became aware of something he could not have named a week earlier, a faint pressure behind his ribs, patient and unfamiliar, like a door he had never noticed was there. He did not know what to do with it, beyond simply reaching toward it, the way a man reaches for a word sitting just out of memory's grasp. For a long time, nothing happened. The mountain air stayed still. Vareth watched without speaking, her amber eyes steady in the darkness. Then, so quietly Daniel almost mistook it for wind moving through the rocks, something answered. It was not a sound exactly. It was closer to a pull, a faint tug somewhere behind his sternum, gone almost as soon as he noticed it. His eyes snapped open, and he looked at Vareth, uncertain whether he had imagined it. "You felt something," she said. It was not a question. "I don't know what it was." "It was an answer," Vareth said, and for the first time since he had met her, something like hope moved through her voice. Faint and far off, but an answer nonetheless. "Try again, Daniel. Reach further this time." He did, night after night. As they moved deeper into mountains, Daniel practiced reaching for that strange pressure behind his ribs, and slowly, the answers grew less faint. On the fifth night, he felt not one pull but three, scattered across different distances, different directions, like candles lighting one by one in a vast dark room. On the seventh night, standing at the edge of a ravine Vareth said had once been a dragon roosting ground centuries before either of them was born, Daniel closed his eyes and reached as far as he had ever reached, further than felt safe, further than felt possible. The answer came back louder than any before it. A sound broke across the mountains, distant but unmistakable, a long, low roar that rolled between the peaks like thunder given purpose. Daniel's eyes flew open in time to see Vareth lift her head sharply toward the sound, her exhaustion forgotten for a single suspended moment. "That is no faint answer," she said. "That is a clan leader." Before the echo of the first roar had fully faded, a second joined it from a different direction, then a third, closer this time, close enough that Daniel felt the ground beneath his boots tremble faintly with the sound. He stood frozen at the ravine's edge, heart hammering, as roar after roar rose from scattered points across the mountain range, each one answering the pull he had sent out without ever knowing what shape his call had taken. "They remember," Vareth said quietly, and there was something in her voice now that Daniel had not heard before, something raw and unguarded. "Not you specifically, not even your name, but they remember the shape of the call, passed down the same way it was passed to you. They remember what it meant when it was last heard, and they are answering it because some part of them has been waiting 300 years for someone to finally ask." Daniel did not trust himself to speak. He simply stood there, listening as the mountains around him filled with voices that had been silent for longer than his kingdom had existed, and understood with a certainty that settled deep into his bones that whatever happened next, he would not be facing it alone. But even as hope rose in his chest for the first time since the dirt had covered his face, a colder thought settled beside it. If he could be heard from this far, so could Vasa's search parties. And if the black ships in the north were half as patient as Vareth feared, they would not need long to notice a mountain range suddenly alive with the roars of creatures the world had been told no longer existed. The clans arrived over the following 3 days, and each arrival changed the shape of what Daniel had begun to believe was possible. The first was a lean, storm-colored dragon named Threk, younger than Vareth by at least a century, who circled the ravine twice before landing and demanding, in a voice sharp with suspicion, to know why a human stood beside the last Dragonbond Queen instead of running from her. Vareth's explanation, delivered with a patience Daniel was beginning to understand came from centuries of practice, was enough to keep Threk's claws from Daniel's throat, though not enough to earn his trust. Not yet. Others followed. A pair of broad, earth-toned dragons who spoke rarely and watched constantly. An old, scarred creature who introduced himself simply as Burn and refused to explain the story behind any of his wounds. By the third day, 11 dragons had gathered in the ravine, more than Daniel had ever imagined could exist quietly hidden across a kingdom that believed their kind extinct. It was not enough, and everyone in that ravine seemed to know it. 11 dragons, most of them younger and untested, against an enemy that had once broken an alliance of hundreds. It was Byrne who first spoke the question no one else wanted to voice. "Even if we stand together," the old dragon said, his voice like stone grinding against stone, "we are 11. The Scoreth came before with numbers no army could hold back. What makes this human believe 11 will be enough?" Daniel had no answer prepared. He looked to Vareth, but for once she did not speak on his behalf. She simply watched him, waiting, the way she had waited through every test since the moment she pulled him from the earth. "I don't believe 11 is enough," Daniel finally said, and the honesty in his own voice surprised him. "I believe it's a start. The bonding call reached 11 of you from wherever you were hiding, which means there are more out there who haven't heard it yet or haven't been close enough to answer. I can't promise this ends a war the first war couldn't finish. I can promise I won't ask any of you to fight it while pretending the odds are better than they are." Something shifted in Byrne's expression, old and unreadable. "An honest human," the dragon said finally. "That, at least, is rarer than an honest Scoreth." The laughter that followed, low and rough among creatures and used the humor, was the first moment Daniel felt something close to acceptance settle over the gathered clans. It did not last long. On the fourth night, the sky above the ravine turned wrong. Not dark exactly, but wrong, the stars swallowed by something moving low and silent across the upper atmosphere. Vareth was on her feet before Daniel had fully processed what he was seeing, her weakened wing forgotten in the sudden urgency of her movement. "They found us," she said, "faster than I feared." The Scoreth ships descended not with fire and noise, but with an eerie mechanical quiet that Daniel found more unsettling than any explosion could have been. Black holes, angular and cold, settled at the far end of the valley, and from them emerged shapes that moved with unnatural precision, more machine than creature, more purpose than instinct. The battle that followed was not the desperate last stand Daniel had feared, but was close enough to terrify him regardless. The dragons fought with a coordination that surprised even Vareth, older instincts surfacing despite centuries of isolation, while Daniel did what he could from the ground, guiding wounded creatures toward cover, shouting warnings when he spotted Scoreth units circling for a second approach. It was in the chaos of the third assault wave that Daniel heard a voice he recognized, cutting through the noise with cold familiarity. "I told them you were dead," Voss said, stepping from the tree line with a drawn blade and an expression that held no surprise at all, only grim resolve. "It seems I will simply have to correct that mistake myself." Daniel turned, and in the space of that single distracted heartbeat, understood that Voss had not come searching for the Scoreth at all. He had come searching for him, tracking the same roars that had gathered 11 dragons to this ravine, arriving the one moment chaos might let him finish what the burial had failed to. Voss moved fast, faster than Daniel expected from a man his age, blade aimed with clear and practiced intent. Daniel raised his arm too late, bracing for a strike. He had no way to stop. It never landed. Vareth moved between them with a speed that should have been impossible for a creature so wounded, her weakened wings snapping forward to shield Daniel completely as Voss's blade found her scarred hide instead of Daniel's chest. She did not roar in pain. She simply exhaled, long and slow, and folded downward into dirt beside him, her amber eyes finding his one final time before the light within him began, unmistakably, to dim. Daniel did not remember screaming Vareth's name, though the raw ache in his throat afterward told him he must have. He knelt beside her in the churned dirt, hands pressed against her side, where Voss's blade had struck, and for one terrible moment believed he had lost her the same way the old Dragonbond warriors had lost everything 300 years too late to matter. Around them, the battle had gone strangely still. Threk had seen the strike. So had Byrne and the pair of earth-toned dragons who had watched Daniel with silent suspicion since the day they arrived. Every dragon in that ravine had turned toward the site of their last living queen, collapsing to protect a human. And in their stillness, Daniel saw something shift, deep and permanent, in the way they looked at him. Voss did not get the chance to strike again. Threk was faster than fear allowed him to be, and it was the sound of the commander's blade clattering uselessly against stone, pinned beneath a claw twice the size of his own hand, that finally cut through the ringing in Daniel's ears. "You would kill your own blood to bury a truth," Byrne said, looming over Voss with an old, terrible patience, The same truth that might be the only thing standing between your kingdom and total ruin. Explain that to me, human, and explain it quickly, because I find my patience thinner than has been in centuries. Voss said nothing. He did not need to. His soldiers, the handful who had followed him into the ravine and witnessed everything, no longer looked at him the way soldiers looked at a commander they trusted. They looked at him the way men look at someone they no longer recognized. Daniel did not have time to consider Voss's fate further. Verith's breathing had grown shallow beneath his hands, uneven in a way that terrified him more than the battle still smoldering at the valley's edge. "Stay with me," he said, voice cracking. "You didn't wake me from that grave just to leave me standing over yours." Verith's eyes opened barely, amber dimmed almost a gray. "I did not save you," she whispered, "so that you would grieve me, Daniel Cole. I saved you so that this would not end the way it ended before." The remaining Scoreth units, deprived of the chaos they'd been counting on, began a slow, calculated retreat toward their ships, unwilling to press an assault against 11 dragons now fighting with a unified fury of creatures defending something worth dying for. By the time the last black hull lifted silently into the night sky, the valley had gone quiet in a way that felt, for the first time in days, like the aftermath of survival rather than the beginning of another loss. It took 3 full days for Verith's strength to steady enough that Daniel allowed himself to believe she would live. The wound was deep, but not as final as it first appeared, and the healing that followed, slow and careful, was tended by dragons who had spent centuries believing they would never again have reason to care for their queen. Word of what happened in the northern ravine reached the kingdom long before Daniel and Verith did. Soldiers did not stay silent about 11 dragons and a commander who tried to murder an innocent man in the middle of battle. And by the time Daniel walked through the gates he had once been marched out of in chains, the truth had already outpaced whatever story Voss might have tried to salvage. Voss stood trial for treason of his own, stripped of rank and title before a kingdom that finally understood what he had buried. And why. Daniel was cleared publicly, fully, in front of the same tribunal that had once condemned him. He did not ask for an apology. He asked, instead, for the old dragon graveyard to be protected, honored rather than feared, a resting place worthy of what it truly was. Vera stood beside him when the kingdom's leaders agreed. Her wing healed enough now to carry her short distances, her amber eyes bright again in a way Daniel had begun to fear he would never see. Around them, the 11 dragons who had answered the stranger's call remained, not out of obligation, but because 11 had already begun quietly becoming more, drawn by stories spreading faster than any bonding call ever could. The Scoreth will return, Vera told him one evening, as the two of them watched the sun set over a valley that no longer needed to hide what lived within it. This was not victory. This was only the first answered call in a war that is far from finished. "Then we'll be ready," Daniel said, "together this time." Verith lowered her head until it rested gently beside him, an old gesture, she told him once, that dragons reserved only for those they trusted completely. "Together," she agreed, "as it always should have been." If you have found your way to this story, and something in it stirred the same quiet hope Daniel carried out of that grave, consider staying a while longer. There are more alliances waiting to be discovered, more bonds worth remembering, and more stories like this one still to come. Subscribe and be here when the next call is answered.